They told Tokyo it was scrap metal, until US engineers made it sail again. January 17, 1940. A cold, damp fog clings to the steel skeletons of the naval yards in Tokyo Bay, where the rhythmic hammering of rivets sounds like the heartbeat of an empire. The air smells of coal smoke and salt, a heavy, industrial scent that masks the growing tension of a world on the brink of collapse. Here, in the shadow of the rising sun, Imperial Japanese engineers look upon the charred remains of a scuttled vessel, a twisted mass of blackened iron and jagged plates. To their eyes, it is a corpse. They see a tomb of rusted bulkheads and flooded engine rooms, a piece of history that has been consumed by fire and water until nothing but a hollow shell remains. They mark the hull for the breakers, convinced that no amount of human ingenuity could ever breathe life back into such a ruin. They whisper to their superiors that this is nothing but scrap metal, a relic of a dying era that will soon be melted down to forge the bayonets of the future. They are certain of this truth because, in their world, resources are finite, and once a thing is broken, it stays broken. They do not yet understand that they are not just looking at a ship, they are looking at the first casualty of an industrial philosophy they cannot yet comprehend. As the 1940s dawned, the world was a chessboard being rearranged by the iron hand of militarism. In Europe, the Blitzkrieg had shattered the illusions of the old guard, while in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was meticulously calculating the geometry of a new ocean empire. For the leadership in Tokyo, the coming conflict was viewed as a war of attrition, a struggle where the side with the most steel and the most unwavering will would inevitably prevail. Their doctrine was built on the principle of the decisive battle, a singular, cataclysmic clash of titans that would sweep the American presence from the Pacific in one stroke. To prepare for this, every scrap of iron was precious. The Japanese economy was a fragile ecosystem, fueled by imported oil and repurposed metal. To them, the idea of waste was a sin against the emperor. If a ship was damaged beyond a certain percentage, it was discarded, its soul extracted to serve in a more efficient form. This was the logic of an empire built on scarcity, a logic that assumed their enemies operated under the same crushing limitations. They believed the Americans were soft, pampered by luxury, and incapable of the gritty, greasy labor required to resurrect a ghost. This miscalculation would become the silent architect of their defeat. The contrast between the two warring ideologies could be heard in the very sounds of their shipyards. In Japan, the work was a testament to human endurance, a grueling symphony of manual labor where thousands of workers toiled in cramped conditions with minimal machinery. In America, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, a different sound was beginning to rise, a roar of diesel engines, the hiss of hydraulic presses, and the crackle of electric arc welding. While the Japanese soldier was taught that his spirit was his greatest weapon, the American engineer was taught that his greatest weapon was his ability to solve a problem with the sheer weight of industrial output. The Japanese expected the Americans to fold once their primary fleet was crippled. They expected a nation of shopkeepers to mourn their losses and sue for peace. Instead, they encountered a civilization that viewed a sunken battleship not as a defeat, but as a blueprint for a miracle. They expected the Americans to be demoralized by the sight of smoke over the horizon. Instead, they found men who looked at a burning wreck and saw a challenge to their craftsmanship. The historical records of the salvage operations at Pearl Harbor and beyond provide a staggering testament to this American defiance. Factual data from the Bureau of Ships reveals that of the 19 vessels sunk or damaged during the attack on December 7, 1941, 15 were eventually returned to service. This was not merely repair work, it was a wholesale resurrection. Consider the case of the USS West Virginia, a ship that had been torn open by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Japanese intelligence reports had officially listed her as lost, a permanent subtraction from the American order of battle. Yet, beneath the oily waters of the harbor, American divers were performing feats that defied the naval manuals of the time. They worked in total darkness, navigating through the jagged ruins of the ship's interior, sealing hundreds of holes with patches made of timber and concrete. The sheer scale of the equipment brought to bear, the massive salvage tugs, the underwater cutting torches, the giant pumps capable of moving thousands of gallons of water per minute, was a physical manifestation of a nation that refused to accept the word impossible. The transformation of the American perception of war was profound. It shifted from a struggle of survival to an exercise in logistics and engineering. The experience of the sea base and the naval repair crews changed the ideology of the front line. They realized that the ocean was not a barrier, but a highway, and that any damage inflicted by the enemy could be undone by the relentless application of American ingenuity. This shift in consciousness was mirrored by a growing realization among the Japanese rank and file. Captured diaries often reflect a haunting sense of dread as Japanese sailors began to encounter ships they believed they had already sunk. To a Japanese gunner, seeing a vessel he had watched sleep beneath the waves months prior suddenly appearing on the horizon, modernized and bristling with new anti-aircraft guns, was more than a tactical setback. It was a psychological blow that struck at the heart of his faith in the war's outcome. It suggested that the Americans possessed a supernatural ability to sunk. To a Japanese gunner, seeing a vessel he had watched sleep beneath the waves months prior suddenly appearing on the horizon, modernized and bristling with new anti-aircraft guns, was more than a tactical setback. It was a psychological blow that struck at the heart of his faith in the war's outcome. It suggested that the Americans possessed a supernatural ability to defy death, a power fueled by a bottomless well of resources. Throughout this industrial crusade, a single, recurring sound served as the heartbeat of American democracy, the rhythmic, percussive thwack hiss of the pneumatic rivet gun. To the Japanese, who often relied on slower, more traditional methods of joining steel, the sound of the pneumatic gun was the sound of a factory on the move. It was a sound that represented the abundance of the American home front, where air compressors and heavy tools were as common as plows. This tool was more than a piece of construction equipment. It was a symbol of the American belief that any gap could be closed, any wound could be stitched, and any ship could sail again. The thwack hiss echoed across the docks of San Francisco, through the repair slips of Pearl Harbor, and into the makeshift dry docks of the South Pacific. It was the sound of a nation of tinkerers and mechanics refusing to let the scrap heap have the final word. It was the sound of democracy's workbench, where every bolt-driven home was a vote for a future free from tyranny. The experience of the USS Cassin and USS Downs further illustrates this theme of resurrection. These destroyers were so badly damaged during the Pearl Harbor attack that they were considered beyond all hope of repair. Their hulls were warped, their machinery shattered by the heat of exploding magazines. Japanese propagandists mocked the Americans for even attempting to salvage them. Yet, the Americans did not just salvage them, they harvested their hearts. The engines and vital components were extracted from the ruined hulls, shipped back to the mainland, and installed into entirely new shaped bodies. When these ghost shapes returned to the fleet, they carried the same names and the same spirits, but they were faster, stronger, and more lethal than before. This was a concept entirely foreign to the Japanese mind, the idea that the essence of a weapon could survive the destruction of its physical form. It was a testament to a philosophy that valued the know-how of the engineer as much as the bravery of the captain. As the war progressed, the disparity in repair capabilities became the decisive factor in the naval campaign. During the Battle of Midway, the American carrier Yorktown was repaired in a mere 72 hours after sustaining damage that Japanese doctrine insisted would take months to fix. The Japanese pilots, seeing the Yorktown back in action, were convinced they were fighting a different ship, leading to confusion and tactical errors that contributed to their catastrophic defeat. The factual records of the 1,400-man repair crew at Pearl Harbor, working around the clock under the blistering sun, underscore the reality that American victory was built in the dry docks as much as it was on the high seas. They used over 300 tons of steel and miles of welding wire just to get the Yorktown back into the fight for those critical days. This was not just a miracle of labor, it was a miracle of supply, a demonstration that the American pipeline of parts and tools was an unbreakable chain. The ideology of the Japanese soldier, rooted in the stoic acceptance of death and the glory of sacrifice, began to crumble when faced with the American ideology of life and renewal. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew that every bullet fired was one less they would ever have. The Americans fought with the confidence of men who knew that behind them stood a continent of humming factories and endless crates of spare parts. This was the ultimate contrast, a culture that glorified the end versus a culture that mastered the beginning. The American engineers, with their greasy overalls and blueprints, were the high priests of this new religion of abundance. They looked at the blackened scrap metal of Tokyo's dreams and saw the foundations of an American reality. They proved that a nation's strength is not measured by what it can destroy, but by what it can rebuild. In the final analysis, the story of the ships that sailed again is more than a footnote in naval history. It is a poetic reflection of the nature of freedom itself. Abundance is not merely the possession of things, it is the freedom to innovate, to fail, and to try again. The Japanese saw scrap metal because their system allowed for no second chances, no deviation from the prescribed path of destruction. The Americans saw a fleet because their system was built on the premise that every individual, from the diver in the mud to the welder on the deck, had the agency to fix what was broken. This is the larger truth that emerged from the smoke of the Pacific, that a society which empowers its people to create will always outlast a society that demands they only obey. The shapes that rose from the depths were iron metaphors for democracy, battered, scorched, and momentarily submerged, but possessed of an internal resilience that allowed them to find their buoyancy once more. When the war finally ended, and the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy lay rusted and defeated in their harbors, the lesson was clear. The engineers who had labeled the American wrecks as scrap metal had been right about the iron, but wrong about the people. They had forgotten that steel has no will of its own, it only goes where the heart of a nation directs it. The American spirit of repair was an extension of the American spirit of liberty, a belief that no matter how deep the water or how hot the fire, there is always a way to make it sail again. Today, the echoes of those pneumatic rivet guns have faded into the silence of history, but the truth they hammered into the hulls of those resurrected ships remains. It is the truth that freedom is the greatest engine of abundance the world has ever known, and that as long as we possess the will to build and the courage to mend, we will never truly be consigned to the scrap heap of time. The ocean still holds the bones of many ships, but it also holds the memory of a time when a nation's grit turned iron into hope, and proved to the world that even the most broken things can be made whole if they are touched by the hands of the free.